Welcome to Beneath the Surface podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Bortz, the Millennial Rabbi. Join me as we talk to high-impact people around the world, discovering deep, meaningful ways to live life beneath the surface. Professor Brian Keating is an astrophysicist with UC San Diego's Department of Physics. He received the 2007 Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers at the White House from President Bush for a telescope he invented at the U.S. South Pole Research Station called BICEP. He co-leads the Simons Observatory Cosmic Microwave Background Experiments in the Atacama Desert of Chile and is the author of Losing the Nobel Prize, a story of cosmology, ambition, and the perils of science's highest honor, selected as one of Amazon.com's 10 best nonfiction books of the month. Hi, Brian. Welcome on. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Rabbi. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, we're coming close to the Genesis, the beginning of the Torah reading, as we were speaking about. And it occurred to me something a rabbi once told me. He told me that he said the universe began with the words of the Torah. The Torah made underlying of the spirituality of the universe. But then he said it really started with the first verse, really started with the first word, Bereshit, really the first letter bet, and really the dot in the bet. Meaning, I think he was kind of referring to the Big Bang concept that really the universe began very small. So I'm fascinated by your work. I'm very novice in it. I know that you had this innovative research with what's called BICEP, and what I learned about it is it was to measure the cosmic microwave background and basically the origins of the universe through the Big Bang, which I can't think of anything cooler than spending your life investigating the beginning of all time. So can you tell me a bit of how that came about, your curiosity in that specific field, and just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I usually say, well, I didn't get into the field for the money, but really for the curiosity of being paid to discover what happened at the very beginning of time, and perhaps the most kind of vexing question of all, whether or not their universe and time itself had a precedent before the Big Bang, or whether or not we essentially mark the beginning of time and the evolution subsequent to what Jews and Christians, et cetera, think of as Genesis. So my research actually is probably the closest you could possibly get to uncovering whether or not the biblical description has a basis in fact, or if it is purely rooted in faith. And I think it's quite flattering and lovely to be able to get paid to build instrumentation that will potentially answer that question rather than purely speculating on it. We have the opportunity now, for the first time in human history, to really ascertain whether or not there's enough evidence, data, et cetera, to support the narrative that is perhaps suggested in the first opening words of Genesis. And if not, perhaps open interesting vistas that are just the most provocative and curious things that you could ever imagine studying.
And I find it fascinating when I was researching that the steady state theory, the idea that there wasn't a Big Bang, it seemed to be almost that scientists around the world during that time, in the earlier 20th century, kind of wanted to resist the Big Bang concept because it might insinuate a beginning to a creation or some sort of...
Yeah, the Big Bang itself, the phrase Big Bang itself was actually an insult. I don't know the explicit rating of your show or not. I'm going to assume that it's not rated explicit, so I won't say what it's a euphemism for. But the words Big Bang, your listeners, viewers can look up what it was a pejorative description of, allegedly in the UK, by its chief detractor, who was a famous atheist named Fred Hoyle, who's genius, one of the most brilliant scientists of the last 100 years. And he deeply detested what was coming to be known as the Big Bang theory of the universe, the origin of the universe, originating from a potential singularity, an infinite or very dense hot state, as the television show suggests, the lyrics to the theme song of the Big Bang theory suggests. And it's not just the TV show that kind of popularized this. It was the inherent confrontation between the data, or lack thereof, supporting the steady state theory, which was championed by this great atheist Hoyle. And he was really holding sway for most of the first half of the 20th century. And his ideas and theories really led to the delay in the acceptance of the Big Bang as the correct description of the events post-Genesis, or perhaps contemporaneously with Genesis. So I think that it's quite interesting that, yeah, that this arose, and the, he's surely turning in his grave. He went to his grave not believing in the Big Bang model of cosmic origin, but instead that it's become so much more popular than the steady state theory would probably give him a lot of angst. However, there are modern incarnations of the steady state theory which are coming back in vogue
Hmm.
in an interesting way, and perpetuating this series of debates, as I describe in my book, that have lasted since antiquity as to whether or not the universe is infinite and eternal, or whether or not it's finite, and whether or not it has sort of epicycles that come in and out of phase with different epochs within the universe. And this is a debate that goes back to Aristotle and before him, and then up until Albert Einstein, and then, as I said, Hoyle, and even my modern experiments that I work on today.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, so you're talking about various theories beyond just the Big Bang, and you just had your very popular video with the Prager University, and you start talking about the subject of the concept of the multiverse. It's a lot to get into, and we're trying to pack in a short amount of time, but the concept of what originated before the Big Bang. So what caused it? How did it come about? My question, maybe you can give some background on it, but my question was, if there was a multiverse and there were many other universes, who knows, even infinitely, that preceded and caused this Big Bang, because there had to be something that began that explosion, so to speak, or that beginning. My question is, even those who bring the multiverse as a theory, do they at all acknowledge that there must be a beginning, or do they look at it almost like the steady state theory, where there's just an endless amount of matter and energy forever, and there's no beginning to multiverses? It just could be on, infinitely going, and just...
Yeah, the problem with the multiverse, from that perspective of questioning whether or not there's a singular origin to our universe, is that it really is kind of commensurate and kind of complementary to the Big Bang, in that it suggests an origin of what we call our observable universe, in other words, the part of the universe that we can see. But it goes beyond that and speculates into regions that are, even in principle, unobservable, distant regions, whether in space or in time, or both space and time, beyond our horizon, so beyond the ability for our telescopes to ever see, because of the evolution of how the universe took place in the first trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second.
Wow.
In its history. And because of this, the universe is so profligate, is so extravagant, that it makes so many copies of potential universes, according to the multiverse paradigm, I should say, that it leads to this potentiality for an infinite number of universes, either separated in space or time, or, as I said, in both. So I think that's quite interesting how we get this ability to speculate on unseen worlds from the paltry or paucity of data that we have about our own observable universe. It's kind of like, you go out on the ocean and you're just surrounded by water, and then if that's where you grew up, you might speculate that there's no one else in the in your watery universe. Or you might say there could be people beyond our horizon, and then you could even say, because I exist, the conditions are right for life forms to exist and conscious life forms to exist. Therefore, there's not only other versions of things like me, conscious entities, but there's potentially an infinite number of them, because who knows how big the sphere or the globe of the Earth is. I have no idea, being isolated observer. And so those are very fascinating possibilities. What troubles me about the multiverse is that it was invented almost by default, that we had to explain our existence given the improbability of the different parameters that define and allow for life and conscious beings to exist. And then not only did it create the possibility, it perhaps created an infinite number of possibilities. So that is a very questionable kind of benefit to science. Is that a good thing for science, to have an unobservable amount of information to perhaps sift through? Or is it, is there something more that it benefits the scientific quest to understand cosmic origins? So right now it's an open question. For a while we thought we had the answer, and I described that in my book, but eventually it was not to be.
Wow. Awesome. Okay. I want to talk a bit. You just mentioned your book. So, losing the Nobel Prize. It's doing really well. It's a very interesting voyage that you go on, and I know there's a lot of. I'd love to know what you feel, what you hope the reader takes away from it, because what I feel like one of the major themes is that just like in life or in business that anyone's doing, it's very tempting to kind of go it alone in order to for independence and self-empowerment and maybe to avoid collaboration, even when that collaboration might benefit your cause more because it
Right.
might maybe lower your shine.
Yeah.
Can you explain the underlying theme or reason that really got you to write the book, or what you'd like people to take
Yeah.
away?
So that's right. I call the universe the ultimate startup, that it really brought everything into existence at the Big Bang. The question as to, what were the conditions like at the very beginning of time was one of the two main motivating factors that caused me to create an experiment called BICEP that I describe in the book. The book is really a memoir of a cosmologist's life battling with sort of egos and personalities, and also with theology and philosophy. And along the way, I also came close to winning the Nobel Prize, and obviously did not, and hence one of the reasons for the title of the book. But the other reason that really motivated me was this lust to win the Nobel Prize. I mean, I make no bones about it, that was for many years an animating impulse in my life that gave me meaning, in addition to other sources of meaning in my life. But it was really an animating thing for me. And nowadays I'm slightly embarrassed to admit it, but I do describe these emotions, and the reason why that was so important to me to garner the respect of people, in particular my father, who was also a great scientist and also a big atheist. And the question of whether or not I could solve this mystery along with collaborators around the world, that would lead me to, assuredly win the Nobel Prize. So that was no small motivation for me. The other, really factor for me when I wrote this book is I wanted to introduce people to the excitement, the passion, the awe of doing cosmology and the modern level of understanding that scientists and colleagues such as myself have. And you really touched upon this notion of collaboration versus competition, which is surprising to people because people think of scientists as, dispassionate eggheads or, affable kind of losers or whatever, like in the Big Bang Theory, or
Mm.
socially awkward people. But at our heart, we are very inquisitive, very curious, very mesmerized by the possibility of understanding new truths in the universe. But we also have some other childlike qualities like jealousy, pettiness, inability to share and play well with others. And sometimes that gets exacerbated when it comes to getting the ultimate accolade that I think humanity bestows, which is the Nobel Prize. And
Mm.
I argue in the book that, something like 90% of scientists are either atheists or devout agnostics, where they do not acknowledge the existence of a God yet, or perhaps ever. And I come to see the Nobel Prize as sort of a secular religion for these people. And I describe my own encounters with it, and how that really shaped my, reflected on how that affected me, and presumably affects other people as well. And I know that it does. I shouldn't say presumably, because many people have come out to kind of express their gratitude for my sentiments, which had gone sort of unacknowledged for many years in the community of scientists that I inhabit.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, for sharing that. It's a very, I definitely recommend everyone out there to take a look at it. It's you're one of the few, I would say. You talked about how this atheism is kind of rampant in the scientific community, and you're one of the few outspoken astrophysicists that is comfortable talking about your faith. And I feel like there doesn't need to be a conflict in that science kind of focuses on more on the what, or a bit of the how also, but religion or other spiritual practices is more focusing on the why. What's our purpose? What's the reason behind everything that's here?
Very good point.
Do you feel that there needs to be kind of the conflict that a lot of people love to talk about? If you read YouTube comments, there seems to be a big focus. People really want to choose one over the other.
Yeah. If you're ever feeling, too full of yourself, read your YouTube comments.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
If you ever have too much vanity. So yeah, exactly. I do feel that, well, first of all, let me say the word science in ancient Greek meant knowledge. And, the word Torah or Old Testament, for the Hebrew word for the Old Testament really means wisdom or teaching. And there's a fundamental difference between knowledge and wisdom. My 7-year-old has a lot of knowledge and he can regale me with, what's the longest word in the Oxford Dictionary, or, he can tell me facts, but, he doesn't have a lot of wisdom yet. And hopefully he will if we continue to inculcate him and educate him and give him teaching through love. But he doesn't have wisdom, or your smartphone has a lot of wisdom, or has a lot of intelligence, rather, can recite a lot of facts if you ask her, Siri, to do so. But on the other hand, you don't expect wisdom from it. So I think science and religion are two different sides of a coin, and just like the two different sides of a coin, they're sometimes you try to press them together to make a single coin. It's not gonna work. So I always say, if you look at Genesis, the description of the Big Bang, if you will, in the Torah, in the Old Testament, in the 5 books of Moses, there's really only 35 verses that describe anything that you could plausibly consider to be Genesis, or the origin of the universe, or origin of species, and many different things have been suggested, whether or not it's a metaphor or whether or not it's supposed to be taken literally. I'm not going to get into that. But if you take the total number of verses in the Torah, there's about 35,000. So that means there's only 0.1% of this book is about, cosmology. Let me just say it's cosmology. Now, if you take the book A Brief History of Time by the noted atheist Stephen Hawking of blessed memory, he probably has about the same ratio of description of religion to total number of verses. He probably talks about God about as much as the Torah talks about cosmology. Why is that? Because his book is not a book about religion. It's not a book about God. He has a later book about God, which is not that great in my opinion, but nevertheless, his most famous book, A Brief History of Time, it's not a theological manifesto. It's a book about cosmology and time and quantum physics, etc. So I think you have to look at a book and you have to judge a book by what its mission is. And the Torah is obviously not a book about cosmology. And when people try to make it into a book about cosmology, it starts to become, it starts to bring up very heated and passionate emotions. Now, I should say that while I do, gently prod my atheist friends and people that I love who are atheists, I said my father is a great atheist. You look at people like Lawrence Krauss or Carl Sagan or Richard Dawkins, and yeah, I have a lot of commentary on their positions on faith, and we can talk about that. But on the other hand, I don't let people like yourself or religiously committed people either get off the hook. And that is to say that if you believe in God and you want to believe more, you'll never have proof. But science is the very tool that God, if you will, gives the religiously faithful to take them to have more faith. So I call science, vitamins of faith. You take vitamins of minerals to strengthen your body, but you can learn science to strengthen your faith. And you really should understand, people say to me, oh, I'm not a science person, I'm not a math person, they kind of roll their eyes about it. I think that's really doing a disservice, not only to, the great accomplishments of science as a cultural institution, but also to the detriment of your religious faith in the existence of God.
That is so beautiful, because Maimonides says if you want to come to a love of God, meditate on his creations. And now that we're learning more and more of what's out there, for me, funny enough, people say when you get more religious, you get more closed-minded to secular culture. For me, it was the opposite. When I was not involved, I spent my time in subjects that I cared about, science, math, maybe not so much. When I started to grow spiritually, I said, wow, now everything has meaning. It's not random. Let me find out. If God formed this in my mind, in my belief, then there must be significance to it. So now I'm fascinated by learning about the universe and how everything came about.
I always say to my kids, and this is, I'm sure some people think it's brainwashing or whatever, but, I always think it's bad when I hear, say, a child who goes to a religious school or something, and you see a rainbow and they say, oh, look, God made that rainbow. So I've told my kids not to say that, and maybe you'll find this very abhorrent, Rabbi, but I'll say when they see a rainbow, I say, and I ask them, well, what caused that? If they say Hashem or God in Hebrew, if they say that, they know I'm not happy with that. Instead, I've taught them to say, no, it's caused by refraction of light as it passes through water molecules. And then I'll say, what is water molecule made of? And they'll say hydrogen and oxygen. they'll say, what's a hydrogen oxygen? That's made of quarks. And what is made of quarks? Quarks are particles, or subatomic indivisible particles of energy and matter, et cetera. And I keep going until I say, well, what made the quarks, or what made energy? And that they'll say they have no answer to. And that's the point where you can say God, if you will. But you shouldn't say God, prematurely, in my mind. And I know it's at odds with some teaching, but I think it limits or let me say it another way. When you say that God created the universe, rather than he just created that rainbow over there, they're both amazing things, but how much more so amazing is the creation of the universe, the laws of physics that permit the existence of one conscious species. We talk a lot, and I think a lot in my research about the existence of other species of civilizations, but it's all the more amazing what if he only created one? And what if there's only, and first of all, what if God exists? And what if, what are the implications of that? But when you limit his power by saying, oh, he just made that rainbow over there, he's making that meteor shower over there, to me, that's diminishing his power. Why not go the real full Monty and say, he made the laws of physics, and he made the laws of mathematics and logic, et cetera, et cetera. I think that for a religious child is a much deeper and leads pedagogically to a deeper rooting in faith.
If you're wondering if that worried me, not whatsoever. I think there's blind faith. Judaism is not big into that. It's knowledge, and then faith that there must be something, I would say, that it's beyond the level of that our minds can reach. That's faith. That we believe there's a level beyond that. But my dad is a doctor, and he wears a kippah to his work. They say, you're a man of science. How could you be a man of faith? And he said, on the contrary, the more that I learn about the intricacies of the body, he was telling me the other day that we have something called the lower esophageal sphincter, which is like microscopic. You can barely see it, but it regulates the pressure in our chest to -5 + 5. And without that, we would just vomit out all our food and drink and die. So it's, is there anything in the universe? There must be so much, but is there something for you that really, certain aspects of it that really just even now will just blow your mind in terms of its...
Oh yeah, absolutely. So my wife and I were blessed to have twins about 5 months ago, a week exactly before my book came out. So it was an exciting week. We became parents of twins in addition to 3 other kids.
It's awesome.
It's just that's really what I feel like my mission in life is to be as a father and educator of my children, and then I expand that to include my ideological children that I get to teach at UCSD. But when the twins were out and they came out, I looked at them and they were coated in this white stuff, and I didn't remember it from my first child's birth and the first 3. And I asked, what is that? And they're like, well, they're coated in wax when they come out. And I'm like, why is that? And they're like, well, imagine you took a bath for 9 months. Like, you'd be soaked, you'd be pruny as all get out, and your skin would be damaged from doing that. And, it would be really wrinkly. And I was, well, what is that? Like, what do we need to have them not be wrinkly for baby pictures? Or is there, that's just such an amazing, and that's much less important. They could live if they didn't have wax, but when you think about just that these things have been secreting, and, they didn't have enough to do when they were inside my wife's uterus, you think about just the amazing, nature of a human being. And, people like to say, and it's a famous atheist argument, and in part, that's why the multiverse was created, to explain the existence of conscious beings such as ourselves. But we are really, the only species that we know about that has consciousness. Maybe not that ever lived, but is here now. And, there's many different types of monkeys. There are many types of Neanderthals and Denisovans and other things. And the question is to whether or not they were conscious, and they some of them may have been, some of them might have been not. But you look at the origin of consciousness, that to me is the most incomprehensible thing, even compared to, the origin of the universe. There are really 3 origins that I would like to understand. And that's the origin of the universe, which is what, I've been able to study and dedicated my career to studying scientifically, experimentally, I should point out as well. And the importance of experimental versus theoretical we can get into. And then part 2 is the origin of life in the universe. That's very difficult to understand. One is universe from non-universe, one is life from non-life. And then the last of the 3 things that perplex me is consciousness from non-consciousness or unconsciousness. Those are the 3 things. I'll never run out of things that I'm, able to want to be curious about and study. So Those, it's a long-winded way of saying that these are the three most fascinating things that if God exists, I want to ask him. Those are the first questions I'm going to ask.
You added, that's beautiful. You added the third one because I've always wondered of the first two. I didn't really in my mind make the distinction of how incredible it is to make that jump to consciousness. But the second one is so, I read a quote from, it was Michael Turner of Chicago Fermilab. He said,
Yep.
the fine tuning of the universe is like taking a dart and throwing it from one end of the universe and hitting a bullseye on the other end, which to me, I mean, it's how we came from that original Big Bang to the life, just life, and the ability of us to exist was always blew my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, those are truly amazing properties that we can even have this conversation, and that the consciousness that is embedded within you allows the real-time decoding of what I'm saying to you, and these questions of free will and whether or not a multiverse exists, and whether or not we are, in some sense, simulations within the multiverse. These are all questions that, in one way or another, I get paid to answer, or at least to think about. And that's what's so delightful. And, I talked to a very, very famous eminent scientist who many people regard as unfairly having lost his own Nobel Prize. And his name is Freeman Dyson. And he won the Templeton Prize, I believe, a couple of years back for kind of harmonization of science and religion. And his point is really a twofold point, that science and cosmology and the origin of the universe, and I add to it consciousness and life, those are great mysteries that we just don't understand. And then the other mystery that we don't understand is God. Now, I'm not saying because they're correlated, they're causative, that God caused these things that we don't have understandings for. That's the so-called God of the gaps hypothesis, or complaint about religious theology. But rather, these are two of the most mysterious things that you can study, and I believe that they're great puzzles. And so, why not? Why people abandon the God hypothesis on one side completely, and then devote all their energy and effort to the scientific hypotheses? Maybe that's because there's only so much time in a day. But I extend the day to mean life, my lifetime. Who knows how long that will be? I want to study as much as I possibly can while I'm still alive and able to draw breath and think about these wonderful, mysterious puzzles.
That's incredible. Do you think it has to do with the way that God is in throughout history and culture? Like when Stephen Hawking, there was the movie on him called The Theory of Everything, and I was learning that there's scientists, since especially Einstein was looking for like an underlying theory that could explain the universe. You could have explained it much better than me, but I always wonder, maybe that is the God that we're talking about. It's a certain intelligence that from the religious community, if we define God beyond this old man in the sky as a king or some, that's not how we look at it. It's a spiritual source that preceded the reality that we know of in the universe, and it's the intelligence behind everything. I think Gerald Schroeder had a book called The Hidden Face of God, where he talks about this theory. So that's the way I've always thought about it. But
yeah, there are interesting, parallels. I think that to say that, well, God is, the originator of the laws of physics is a much more, and the theory of everything is an attempt to encapsulate, if you will, all the laws of physics, which we think can explain in principle all the laws of chemistry, which explains all the laws of biology, et cetera, that, in some way you could write down an equation which would fit on a t-shirt that would have this mathematical elegance and beauty about it. But there's no guarantee that that's the case. It has been true that we have been able to reduce, 3/4 of the laws of nature to that t-shirt equation. But the last one, gravity, and making it in harmony with what's called quantum mechanics, has eluded us and eluded Einstein, eluded Hawking, and it may not even be possible to construct. Those are, those again would be fascinating things to understand, and they're another example of great puzzles and mysteries that are, the privilege of the purview of astronomers and physicists like myself to study and then communicate to those of you out there who are not scientists. I believe it's an obligation. It's like if you have this Torah wisdom, Rabbi, and then you just kept it to yourself on an island, and you refuse to share it with you. I think, if you were supported by the public, I think you'd have a greater obligation. So I'm paid by the public, both in my salary as a University of California employee, but also by virtue of getting my grants from and research support from the National Science Foundation, NASA, the Department of Energy. And I believe I have an obligation to explain that to the general public in the most simple, direct, but not too simple and too direct language that I'm capable of accomplishing.
I feel the pain and excitement of taking something so deep in each of our own respective fields and trying to not dilute it, but give it over in a way that can be grasped and taken in. Because it's very nice to have that knowledge. If you can't communicate it, you could have the most brilliant professors, but if they're not able to bring that out, I saw in one of your TEDx talks, so you had a beach balls flying, you had things making it interactive. That's crucial to really bring the idea across. So just to wrap up, I could talk to you, I really feel like, for the rest of the day.
We will soon, Robin.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Just to close off with a question that I've wondered about is, the universe is so vast. And, I think I was watching the movie Contact, or one of those movies where they talk about if the Carl Sagan, where the universe is so vast, there must be something more out there. And yet we haven't really found, intelligent life or alien life. If there wasn't, one idea I had was that maybe the reason for that is to create a bit of humility in man. Like, even if there wasn't life, just knowing that there's such a vastness to the universe, it's very easy to be ego-centered. We're all mini gods thinking everything's around us. And just by being aware that we're so small, we don't have to be scared by it, but just to have a bit of awe, a bit of looking up at the stars, that alone, just for, if it's all about this world, that would still be something I think would be a reason for, on a cosmic level, for that to exist. Does the vastness of the universe, you think about?
Yeah, this is something that's become very interesting to me, both in the intersection between what I do and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and also these questions of theology, et cetera. As I said, the three most important questions, in my less than humble opinion, have to do with the origin of life from non-life, the origin of consciousness from unconscious or non-consciousness, and then the origin of the universe. And I'm only able to study one of those in great depth, but it doesn't prevent me from speculating wildly on the other two. So I'll say about humility, I think that's a very wonderful point that you're making. And actually, Dennis Prager expressed it once, I believe. He said, they say, well, like, chimpanzees share 96% of our chromosomes with human beings. And he said, I wish it was 100%, and it's like, because then you really would have to think that there's something extra, there's some extra secret sauce or something. If 4%, say, oh, that 4% is really important. If you add 4% of arsenic to your oatmeal, you're not going to live very long, right? So, that allows a lot. But then you think, well, we're like 50% in common with like slime mold inside of yogurt. So that does give humility that we are, but it also should give us greatness. It should make us feel like, well, we have this unique mission on all of the Earth's, surface. There are people who speculate that, cockroaches have consciousness, that, individual, protons have consciousness. It's croutons have consciousness. So, but I think that's a little bit far-fetched and ridiculous, and just shows that it's baffling to even experts in the field what the definition of consciousness even is. But we know it, we feel it, we believe that we have it. And without speculating on, whether or not we have free will, et cetera, we can say that we believe we have this illusion of consciousness. And what can we do with that illusion? As I said, humbly, as you say, humbly rather. And I think it is commensurate with the more and more I study this question of, the probability of life in the universe from a purely physicist standpoint, looking at all the factors that go into life, all the factors that go into consciousness and technology, et cetera, the less likely it seems that there are other planets. In fact, a book written by someone who's in the same publishing company as me, Professor Adam Frank at University of Rochester, he has this book out about where he speculates that, there could be at least 100 other civilizations like ours that originated in the entire universe over the entire history of the universe. And he thinks that's a big number, 100, and none of which have ever been observed, and likely none of which will ever be observed because they could have died out a long time ago, or they could have been non-communicative, et cetera. So I think he sees that as very hopeful. I see that as very bleak for the prospects of life on other planets. And we both draw the same final conclusion, which is that we have to treat every human being in the planet that we live on with great sanctity and reverence, not worship it, but we need to see that every human being is infinitely valuable. And you can say that's because we're created in the image of God, or you can say that's because we are the only entities we know about in the observable history of the universe, in the observable visible universe, that has the ability of what we call consciousness. So I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think we should be, simultaneously, we should have in each one of our pockets, you're the reason the universe was created, and the other one, are merely ashes and dust, as the Talmud says. And I speculate on the meaning of that last statement about dust very heavily in my book.
And I think you hit upon that with the 96% and the 4%. The aspect of us that's like animal is dust and will go away. But that angelic side of us is something to be proud of. And we have a big mission on this earth.
That's right.
Brian Keating, I want to thank you and your whole field in astrophysics for giving me, I get emotional just thinking about, like you said earlier in the podcast, it's one thing to be like, for me, there's a great God out there, but what's great mean? When you realize how much there is up until reaching spiritual life, when you realize how vast this whole creation is, for me, I appreciate even more so, and it gives me more of a way to imagine the grandness of a God. So
Absolutely.
For me, I appreciate all the work that you guys are doing.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi. It's been a real honor and pleasure to be on the show, and looking forward to many more strong interactions with you in the future.
As am I. Looking very forward. Thank you, sir.